Patrick Ferguson made one mistake. He sent a message, not to Washington, not to Cornwallis, not to any general or any army. He sent it to the men living over the mountains. The message said this: lay down your weapons, swear loyalty to the king, and return to your homes, or he would march his army over the mountains, burn everything they had built, and hang their leaders. He expected surrender. What he got was 900 men who had never fought together, had no uniforms, no orders, and no connection to the Continental Army, walking out of the wilderness and climbing a mountain to kill him. 65 minutes later, Ferguson was dead. His army was destroyed. And the British Southern strategy, the plan that was supposed to end the American Revolution, began to unravel. Britain didn't lose King's Mountain because the Americans had a better army. They lost because one officer threatened the wrong people. This is the story of how Britain accidentally created an enemy it never understood, and paid for it on a ridge in South Carolina. This story is not really about a battle. It is about a miscalculation so fundamental that it reversed the entire momentum of the war in a single afternoon. The British Southern strategy had been built on an assumption that the people of the southern colonies were largely loyalist, that they wanted to return to British rule, and that all they needed was a military presence strong enough to protect them while they rose up against the rebellion. Defeat the Continental Army, hold the major towns, let the Loyalists do the rest. For a time, it worked. Charleston fell. Camden was a catastrophe for the Americans. The organized Continental presence in the South had been effectively eliminated. Cornwallis was planning his march north, treating the Carolinas as pacified territory behind him. The strategy had one blind spot. The British understood Loyalists. They did not understand the men over the mountains. The Overmountain Men, the settlers of what is now eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia, were not Loyalists. They were also not exactly patriots in the organized political sense. They were something the British had no framework for at all. They were people who had spent their lives building something from nothing, in territory that nobody else wanted. Men who had crossed the Appalachian Mountains and carved out farms and communities in land that belonged by British royal proclamation to the Cherokee Nation. Men who had fought the Cherokee for years to protect what they had built. Men who had almost no relationship with the colonial political establishment in the East, who had, in many cases, left the East specifically to get away from it. They were fiercely independent, deeply suspicious of any authority that tried to tell them what to do, and entirely capable of organized violence when they felt their world was being threatened. Patrick Ferguson did not know this when he sent his message. If he had, he would not have sent it. Before we go any further, subscribe right now if you are not already here, because this is exactly the kind of story that most history books reduce to a single paragraph. A battle fought by people who are not supposed to matter, by men with no rank and no recognition, whose decision to walk out of the wilderness changed the course of a revolution. This channel exists for stories like this one. To understand how Ferguson's message became a catastrophe, you first have to understand how well the British Southern strategy was going in the summer of 1780. In May, British General Henry Clinton had taken Charleston with 14,000 troops and a fleet of warships. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered, the largest American defeat of the entire war. The Continental Congress was in shock. Washington was stretched thin in the north and could not send significant reinforcements south. In August, General Horatio Gates marched an army of 3,000 south to confront Cornwallis and was routed at Camden in less than an hour. The British force was half the size of the American one. It did not matter. Gates's army was destroyed. Gates himself fled the battlefield and did not stop riding for days. 2 American armies in 3 months. The South appeared broken. Cornwallis controlled the major towns. He had constructed a chain of fortified outposts across the interior of South Carolina, designed to hold the countryside and support Loyalist communities. And he had dispatched some of his best officers to pacify the remaining pockets of resistance and recruit Loyalist militia to police the regions between the garrisons. Patrick Ferguson was one of those officers. Ferguson was not a minor figure. He was 36 years old, one of the finest combat soldiers in the British Army, and the inventor of a breech-loading rifle that was so far ahead of its time that the British Army eventually declined to adopt it, a decision that historians have argued about ever since. He was an aggressive, intelligent, charismatic officer who had spent the Carolina campaign building a Loyalist militia force that was, by the standards of irregular warfare, genuinely impressive. He had trained over 1,000 Loyalist militia to fight with bayonet discipline. He had terrorized rebel sympathizers across the Carolina backcountry. He had never lost a battle. Cornwallis trusted him completely. In September of 1780, Ferguson was operating in the Western Carolinas, recruiting Loyalists and suppressing rebel activity near the foot of the Appalachian Mountains. His force numbered roughly 1,000 men, mostly Loyalist militia with a small corps of regular British infantry. He was aware that there were communities of settlers beyond the mountains. He had received reports that some of these men had been riding east to harass his Loyalist militia and interfere with his recruiting operations. He decided to send them a message. The message was delivered by a paroled American prisoner, a man who had been captured and released to carry Ferguson's ultimatum over the mountains. The words were direct, almost contemptuous. If the men over the mountains did not desist from their opposition to the British arms and submit to the laws of the king, Ferguson would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. Ferguson intended the message as a show of force, a demonstration of British power that would frighten the frontier settlers into compliance, or at least into staying on their side of the mountains and leaving his operations alone. He fundamentally misread the people he was threatening. The Overmountain Men were not afraid of threats. They had been living with mortal threats for years, from the Cherokee, from the wilderness itself, from the sheer difficulty of surviving in territory that the Eastern establishment had essentially abandoned them to. A British officer sending a message from a comfortable camp somewhere east of the mountains was not a source of terror to men who had been fighting for their survival since they crossed the Appalachians. He was a target. The message arrived at the Sycamore Shoals settlement in what is now Elizabethton, Tennessee, in late September 1780. The leaders of the Overmountain communities, Isaac Shelby, of what is now Sullivan County, Tennessee, John Sevier, of Washington County, William Campbell of Virginia, and others, met and made a decision with extraordinary speed. They would not submit. They would not stay home. They would march east, find Ferguson, and destroy him. Within days, riders were spreading through the mountain communities, calling men to muster. The response was remarkable. Men came not because Washington sent them, not because the Continental Congress ordered them, not because any formal military authority had requisitioned their service. They came because someone had threatened their homes. That distinction is everything. This was not a recruited army. It was not a conscripted force. It was not even a formally organized militia in the legal sense. It was something the British had no word for and no plan to counter. A community responding as a community to a direct threat against its existence. On September 26, 1780, roughly 1,000 Overmountain men assembled at Sycamore Shoals. Many had walked or ridden days to be there. They had their own long rifles. They had their own horses. They had their own food, or what food they could carry. They had no uniforms, no artillery, no formal chain of command in any sense that a European military officer would recognize. What they had was an objective: find Ferguson, kill him or capture him, end the threat. A frontier preacher named Samuel Doak gave a sermon before the march. He invoked the biblical story of Gideon, the judge of Israel, who defeated a vast enemy army with a small force of chosen men. The symbolism was not lost on his audience. Stop here for a moment. No Washington, no Continental Congress, no orders from anyone in the formal military structure of the revolution. Just 1,000 men who had been threatened and who decided together, without being asked, that the threat would not stand. This is the moment the British Southern strategy began to die, not on a battlefield. In a valley in Tennessee, where ordinary people made an extraordinary decision. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens when these men find Ferguson is one of the most extraordinary 65 minutes in American military history, and you are going to want to see every second of it. Then they marched. Ferguson received word that a large force of Overmountain Men was moving toward him and made the decision that would seal his fate. He retreated. Not in panic. His retreat was methodical and deliberate. He sent messages to Cornwallis requesting reinforcement and began moving his force toward a defensive position while he waited for help to arrive. He chose Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain was a rocky, forested ridge on the border of North and South Carolina, about 50 miles west of Charlotte. It was 60 feet high at its peak, roughly 600 yards long. Ferguson looked at it and saw a natural fortress. The slope was steep enough to make an uphill assault costly. His men could shelter behind the trees and rocks on the summit and fire down on anyone who tried to climb. He reportedly told his men that he was on Kings Mountain and that God Almighty could not drive him off it. That confidence was not irrational by conventional military standards. Ferguson's position on the ridge was genuinely strong against a conventional assault by formed infantry. But the men coming for him were not conventional infantry. They were frontier riflemen who had spent their lives hunting in exactly this kind of terrain. They did not advance in neat lines across open ground. They moved through woods the way they always moved through woods, from tree to tree, using every piece of cover, firing at specific targets. The Overmountain Men reached Kings Mountain on the afternoon of October 7, 1780. They had marched through 2 days of hard rain, covering extraordinary distances. Some had ridden ahead faster than the main column to prevent Ferguson from escaping. They surrounded the ridge, the entire perimeter, and began climbing from every direction simultaneously. The battle that followed was not what Ferguson expected. The Overmountain Men climbed in silence at first, spread across the entire circumference of the ridge. When the British sentries spotted them and opened fire, the Americans answered with the rifle fire they had been practicing their entire lives. Ferguson's Loyalist militia fought back hard. They were trained. They had bayonets, a weapon the frontier riflemen largely did not carry. Whenever the American lines were pushed back by a bayonet charge down the slope, the Americans simply fell back, regrouped in the trees, and resumed climbing. This was the tactical problem Ferguson had no solution for. A bayonet charge down a wooded slope works against formed infantry who will stand and take it, or break and run. It does not work against men who scatter into the trees, wait for the charge to exhaust itself, and then follow the retreating soldiers back up the hill while shooting them. The American commanders, Shelby, Sevier, Campbell, and others, had no formal plan beyond surround the ridge and climb. There was no coordinated signal system, no synchronized assault on a specific side, no prearranged fire plan. What there was instead was a group of men who understood this terrain instinctively and who were fighting with a fury that came not from professional training, but from the very specific anger of people defending their homes. Ferguson moved constantly during the battle, riding back and forth along the ridge on his horse, directing his men, trying to organize a defense that kept collapsing under pressure from every direction. He was impossible to miss, a mounted officer in a distinctive checked shirt moving through the chaos. He was reportedly shot multiple times. The exact number is disputed. At some point he fell from his horse and died on the ridge. The battle lasted 65 minutes. When Ferguson fell, the Loyalist militia began surrendering. Some tried to raise white flags. The fighting did not stop immediately. The frontier riflemen were not trained in the etiquette of formal surrender, and some continued firing after the white flags appeared. The officers eventually stopped it. The final count was stark. Ferguson's force of roughly 900 men, 220 killed, 160 wounded, 690 captured. The Overmountain Men, 28 killed, 62 wounded. It was not a battle. It was a destruction. Cornwallis received the news of King's Mountain, and it changed everything. He had been preparing to march north into North Carolina, treating the Carolinas as secured behind him. King's Mountain told him they were not secured. It told him that 1,000 men with no formal military structure, no Continental Army connection, and no authorization from anyone had just annihilated one of his best officers and his entire command. He abandoned his march north. He pulled back to South Carolina. The momentum of the British Southern strategy, the momentum that had seemed unstoppable since the fall of Charleston, stopped at King's Mountain. The battle bought the Continental Army the time it desperately needed. Nathaniel Greene arrived in the South in December 1780 to take command of the rebuilt Continental forces. He spent the following months fighting the guerrilla campaign alongside Francis Marion and others that gradually bled the British of manpower, supplies, and the initiative they had seized in the summer. King's Mountain did not win the war, but it stopped the British from winning it in 1780. And the reason it happened was not strategic genius. It was not the work of trained soldiers executing a military plan. It was the predictable consequence of a miscalculation. Patrick Ferguson had looked at the frontier communities over the mountains and seen people who could be intimidated, people who would submit when threatened by a real army, backed by the power of the British Empire. He was wrong about almost everything that mattered. He did not understand that these communities had spent years building their independence, from the Eastern establishment, from the Cherokee, from anyone who tried to tell them what they could and could not do on land they had won with their own blood. Threatening them did not produce submission. It produced something far more dangerous. It produced unity. 900 men who had never fought together, who came from different communities in different territories, who had different leaders and different local loyalties, marched east together because one British officer had threatened the thing they all had in common: their home. There is a military concept that commanders have understood since antiquity, that the most dangerous enemy you can create is not the one who fights you because they are ordered to. It is the one who fights you because you have given them no choice. Ferguson gave the Overmountain Men no choice. King's Mountain was not in any battle plan Washington drew up. The men who fought it received no orders from the Continental Congress. They were not supplied by the Continental Army. They were not paid, uniformed, or formally organized in any way that the existing military and political structures of the Revolution recognized. They showed up because someone threatened them, and in showing up, they demonstrated something that every military strategist since has had to reckon with. Conventional military power, the kind that can take cities, defeat armies in open battle, and hold fortified positions, is not sufficient to control a population that has decided it will not be controlled. The British had more soldiers. They had professional training. They had artillery and supply lines, and the resources of the most powerful empire on earth. They had loyalists who genuinely supported their cause. They had a strategy that had been working. And they lost a 1,000-man force in 65 minutes to men wearing hunting shirts. Not because those men were better soldiers, because those men had been told that everything they had built would be burned. Cornwallis learned something at King's Mountain that his superiors in London never fully absorbed. That the war in the South was not primarily a military problem, it was a political one, and military solutions applied to political problems have a way of making those problems worse. Ferguson's message was supposed to end resistance. It created resistance where almost none had existed. That is the lesson King's Mountain has been teaching for 240 years, and it is a lesson that keeps having to be learned again. Here is the question I want you to take into the comments. If Ferguson had never sent that message, if he had simply ignored the Overmountain Men and continued his operations in the Eastern Carolinas, does King's Mountain happen? Does the British Southern strategy survive into 1781 without this battle to stop it? I genuinely do not know the answer. Neither do the historians, because the alternative requires Ferguson to understand something about the people he was dealing with that he clearly never understood at all. Drop your answer below, because this is one of those moments in history where one decision, a message sent by one man, changed everything. And the question of whether it had to happen that way is worth arguing about. If this story changed how you think about what actually creates an enemy, share it, not for the channel, because the lesson is still being learned today. Subscribe if you are not already here, because next time we are covering another moment when an empire underestimated exactly the wrong people, with consequences that would reshape an entire continent. The ridge is just where this one happened.